Ok, e aí galera, boa noite para todo mundo que está aí acompanhando mais um evento do Psychomaniacs, tá? Obrigado a todos vocês, sempre interessados em aprender mais aí sobre Azure, sobre SQL Server. Hoje a gente tem o Warner falando mais sobre Azure, o assunto bem legal que vocês têm pedido bastante, tá? Não vou enrolar muito, quero agradecer a todos vocês que estão participando. Eu estou aqui de olho no chat, então vocês podem fazer perguntas. Se vocês não tiverem facilidade para perguntar em inglês, não tem problema, pergunta em português, eu passo aqui para o Warner, tá, galera? Então, chega de enrolação, vou passar aqui a bola para o Warner. Hey, Warner, thank you again for your time, and we are really excited to hear you again talking about Azure and SQL Server.
Absolutely. It's great to be presenting for Mo Pessoal no Brasil. It's a beautiful night here in Canada, believe it or not, and it's probably a very beautiful night in Sao Paulo as well. Am I good to share a screen now? Yeah. Compartir tela. Yeah, there we go. All right, now you guys can see Vidar on mine. So let's kick it off here. And topic for tonight is to journey to the cloud with Azure Database Migration Service. Goal that I wanted to put together this session is just basically to show people what the Azure Database Migration Service looks like and the reason why you might consider to use it, pretty much. And also because nowadays, I mean, we know this, not just Microsoft, but Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they're all pushing hard for people to migrate to the cloud. Many of us will have pressure from our jobs at some point to migrate to the cloud. So it's good to know the tools that we can use when eventually that day comes that we need to start migrating some of our databases to the cloud if you're not doing it already, right? So quick introduction about myself. I am a DBA and consultant now for 12 years going. I used to work in Costa Rica. Now I work with Vidar in Pythian, which is based out of Ottawa, Ontario. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. Feel free to reach out to myself and any of my contacts that you see over there at Warchav on Twitter, the blog, the email address, or check out also our company blog, pythian.com. It has a lot of really good technical resources, not just about SQL Server, Azure, or Microsoft, but pretty much about every other data-related technology on the world. So the agenda for today, the objective, of course, is to introduce all of you into the Azure Database Migration Service, which I will be referring to as ADMS because saying Azure Database Migration Service all the time is really long, and its capabilities. So we're going to go over the introduction as to what the service is, how the service works, the different tiers, the cost, and the model, the main features of the service and how you would work with it. And of course, we're going to do some demos. So we're going to show you on the portal what it looks like when you create the service. Then we're going to run through a very simple migration of a VentureWorks 2008 from SQL Server on a VM to an Azure SQL database. And we'll see how the service behaves with some of the compatibility features and what basically the interface walks you through when you are going to migrate, right? Prerequisites really for understanding the session is not much, just that you have some basic database experience and some basic Azure experience. The portal experience is super simple though, so you'll see on the demos that even if you don't have Azure experience per se, you can just navigate the portal really easily. And I assume obviously all you guys are SQL maniacs, so you all have database experience at this point. So let's talk about Azure Database Migration Service. So obviously it's a Microsoft Azure service. You're not going to find it anywhere else. And the idea is that we want to remove friction of moving databases to Azure. So the idea is that we want to make it very simple to move databases to Azure. We want to basically hold people's hands as they do their migrations to Azure so that we can increase the velocity and make it as easy as possible for people to start using Azure in terms of their database storage. So it's a very streamlined experience, which means it just, gives you a few options. It holds your hand. It walks you through the process, kind of like almost wizard style. And the nice thing about it is that it is a managed service, so you don't have to boot up a VM. You don't have to manage the infrastructure that is doing the migration. You just have to do the configuration. And after that, of course, Microsoft takes care of the rest, right? So if you were working on this, doing it on your own, it will be a little bit different, right? And we'll look into detail on that comparison in a little bit. Now, I do want you guys to see right now on the screen, it's not the SQL Server Database Migration Service. It's the Azure Database Migration Service. So it is not just for SQL Server. Later on the presentation, we're going to look at all the sources and the targets that are supported by the service. But just to make it really clear from the start, it doesn't just work with SQL. It works with a lot of different ones, because remember, Microsoft now does PostgreSQL and MySQL as first-party managed services, and also Cosmos DB now has compatibility with MongoDB and Cassandra as well, right? So keep that in mind. So let's look at the value proposition of why you would want to use database migration service versus just doing it yourself, figuring out the steps yourself and doing things manually yourself, okay? So if you were to do yourself, you would have to set up and configure some sort of solution to migrate. Let's say even if it's something as simple as just backup and restore to the cloud, well, you still need to create your storage account in the cloud. You would still need to upload the backup. They would still need to restore it. Or you would need to figure out what is the best way to move the data over. So you still have to figure out some things, right? In terms of ADMS, you don't have to figure out the solution. ADMS is the solution, right? If you have options to figure out the migration mechanism, then you might be thinking, well, I wonder if it's better to BCP the data over, or I wonder if it's better to try backup and restore, or I wonder if backup and restore is supported at all. So again, these choices are taken out of your hands, and you just basically have to follow what ADMS is asking you in terms of information, and then it executes the migration with its own mechanism. You don't have to worry about the actual mechanism, right? If you do it yourself, then you also have to make sure that my solution is running okay, especially if you're dealing with larger databases, right? So, let's say you're doing a migration that's going to take several days, right? Let's say we are going to be replicating some data over, and then we started the migration on Monday, and it's going to be over on Friday. Then we got to make sure that everything's working fine until Friday, right? Because otherwise we're in trouble. ADMS, of course, the service is managed and monitored by Microsoft. So we don't have to worry about the reliability of those VMs that run the migration, or have to be monitoring to make sure that everything's still up and running and so on, right? It's a managed service from Microsoft. Now, if you do it yourself, the last thing is that depending on the situation, you might have to use some resources. Let's say you had to use like a machine that's used for staging before you move it to the cloud and so on. Well, at the end of the process, then you might be holding on to some resources that you don't really need. It was just needed during the migration, or maybe some storage space that you needed as a way to keep some intermediate data or something like this before the migration. So the problem here, of course, is that if you're doing this on premises and it's everything, things that you own, then at the end of the process, even though you migrated, you still have them left over. Right, in the cloud, once you're done with the migration, you destroy the migration service, no harm, no foul, not gonna get charged anymore, right? Now, the migration service is not a one-stop solution. So I have to say that from the beginning. There are two main tools that you might still need to use that might be a little bit interesting depending on what you're trying to do. So if you are migrating from SQL Server into one of the different flavors of Azure SQL, or into SQL on a VM, for example, you will still probably will end up using the data migration assistant from Microsoft. And I'm going to show why in one of the demos. Okay, so we are going to be using the data migration assistant today. And the reason is that the data migration assistant has the assessment capability. It has the capability to analyze the database and figure out if there are compatibility issues with the service that you're trying to go into, right? The Azure Database Migration Service doesn't do any assessment. It just tries to migrate the schema, and then if the schema is there, it just moves the data, and that's it. It doesn't warn you about compatibility problems. It doesn't tell you if a particular feature is not supported in Azure SQL. right? All it does is to either move the schema or move the data. No warnings at all about compatibility. So you still, obviously, for a successful upgrade or migration, everybody that is here on this session, I'm sure you're all really competent DBAs. You know that there's usually a likelihood that there might be some compatibility issues, deprecated issues, things like this, right? So we want to catch those before we actually do the migration. And the way to catch them is by running the data migration assistant, right? Second, another tool that some of you might be familiar with is the SQL Server Migration Assistant. And this one is the one that is used for moving from Oracle or Access or DB2 or MySQL or SAP ASE into SQL Server, right? So this is the one that you would use for platform migration, right? And it's the same thing. If I just go ahead and try to do a platform migration with Azure Database Migration Service, it's not necessarily going to work because of so many compatibility issues, right? There might be a lot of compatibility problems that come up. If you would be better by just doing a conversion with SQL Server Migration Assistant first, and then from there to Azure, right? So it all depends on the case of what you're trying to do. You might still need these extra tools. I would say that the data migration assistant you will probably always need if you are migrating from SQL Server. So this is what the workflow is in terms of how I envision it, is that you would use the database migration assistant for analysis, like I said, and potentially to create the database and create the schema. And then you can use the database migration service for data migration. So you let the database migration service help you with the scale and the performance to migrate the data over. And when you're ready, you would just do the cut over to Azure. Now, something that's very important and I want to emphasize is that if you are working with small databases or just very few databases, then you can actually use the data migration assistant for everything. Because the data migration assistant also has an offline, or let's call it offline, it's basically is like a backup and restore type of migration scenario supported in the tool. So if you're just migrating 3 databases and each one is just a few megabytes or even a few gigabytes, you don't even need the migration service. You could just use the database migration assistant, run it from a computer that has connectivity into Azure, and then probably in 20 minutes, half an hour, your migration will be done for each database and you're done. The data migration service is really an advantage when you're dealing with really big databases where you're not going to just, let's say you try to migrate a database that's like 3 terabytes with the data migration assistant, and then you're like halfway through it and it's taking many hours, and then the data migration assistant just dies, right? Or the laptop that you're running it on crashes, or any of these other things that can happen, right? So you don't want to leave that for a desktop kind of like tool to be doing that migration. Or if you're doing a migration where you need like the real-time replication, then the data migration service is going to help you with that as well. Because the data migration assistant doesn't have that capability. So again, if you're doing something very simple, very small, not a lot of data, you can use the data migration assistant for the whole thing. But if we are looking into migrating big databases, many databases, we want to do it at scale, then the database migration service is where that shines in that scenario. So I'm just going to show you real quick what it looks like when we create the service. So we get out of the slides for a little bit and let's check it out here. So I am in the Azure portal. And if you just search for database migration, I should get something here. So you can see here it says Azure Database Migration Services, right? So we get this right here. So this, and just click on it, and you'll be able to see that I actually have one already deployed because it's the one I'm going to use for my demo. But I'm going to walk you through here on the process of adding a new one. Okay, so let's just fill something up here real quick. We'll wait for it to refresh. And let's see. Sometimes these blades take too long. I just try again. See, now it's instantaneous. So service name, first you have to give it some name. It doesn't really matter what name it is. And then next thing, you have to pick the subscription that you want to do. Let's say if I wanted to create a resource group for it, so I would just say some name as well. So here are the actual real interesting choices in terms of creating the data migration service. This is where the meat and potatoes are of the creation scenario, is that first you have to pick where it is, which is very important, of course, because you want it to be close to where your databases are, right? You're migrating data, you want it to be fast. So if I'm here in Canada, I'm not going to select Brazil South. And if you're in Brazil, you're not going to select the Canada region, right? Makes sense. Second, we have to make a choice of a virtual network, okay? And if I go in and click on this, you will be able to see that it actually gives you a chance to create a new virtual network if it doesn't find already a virtual network in the subscription that you are selecting, in the resource group that you are selecting as well, okay? So why does it need to be in a virtual network? So this is something that's very important too, because for example, when you create an Azure SQL database, it doesn't force you to put it in a virtual network, right? Um, but the migration service, it does. So for a migration service, and we'll see this in a little bit in the slides, there's different ways in which it works in terms of connectivity, but it's always inside a virtual network. So it means there's always that network boundary around the database migration service, so that all the traffic that you're going to be pushing for your databases that you are migrating to Azure is going to go through this virtual network, right? So if you already have a virtual network, that is the one where you know you're going to be placing your databases, or you have some VMs there where your main applications are going to be, when you can deploy the database migration service to this virtual network, right? And then the other thing here, of course, is the pricing. There's two tiers, and I'll go into details in a little bit on the slides about the tiers. But for now, it's just important to figure out here. We have standard and we have premium, okay? And we'll see in detail what those are, all right? So standard and premium, keep that in mind as well. And that's all it is. I'm not going to click create because I already have one created. But that's pretty much all it is that you need to do to create one. So a good location, figure out where you're going to place it in terms of what virtual network you're going to place it in. And then, of course, figure out if you're going to do standard or premium. And we'll look in the slides to see what the differences are between standard and premium. Okay. So let's walk back into the slides. Let me make this big again. Okay. So this is the default configuration, or like what basically how you will be working in if you just, you deploy the service and that's it. So if you don't add any extra pieces, then basically everything would have to be in the cloud, right? Because you would need to have connectivity to the database migration service. And as long as you have connectivity to that database migration service, and that database migration service has connectivity to your SQL database, for example, your SQL database server, then you would be able to do the migration, right? So in this case, it would all be in the cloud, and as long as the cloud security configurations allow the communication of these components, then the migration can happen, all right? Now, I know what you're thinking. For most people, that's not going to be the default configuration. For most people, what they're looking to do is to migrating databases that they have on premises in their own data center to the cloud, right? So as I mentioned before, ADMS has to live inside a virtual network. So it means that to make that connection from on-premises to the ADMS, you will want to have either an express route or a VPN. There's another very unsafe option, which is to expose your ADMS to the internet. 100% do not recommend that. You should not be doing that. What you want to do is to have some sort of tunnel from your own premises to the virtual network where the ADMS is. And right now, the options are to do express route or VPN. If you are not familiar with the difference between these two, I'll just do a very quick summary right now about what the difference is. An express route is a circuit connection that goes through a telecommunications provider infrastructure and then into Azure's infrastructure. Okay, so let's say, for example, here in Canada, there's a big telecommunications company called Bell. So if, let's say, my company wants to do express route to Azure, then Bell comes in and they connect this like VPN device basically to their circuit, and then from their data center, they configure another circuit that connects into Azure directly. So when you go through an express route, your traffic is going through your telecommunications provider and does not touch the internet, right? So you can see how that's a big difference. A, in terms of security, nobody, the internet, everybody can sniff packets, obviously. And B, in terms of reliability, because whenever you're sending or receiving something from the internet, you are always at the mercy of random internet traffic patterns, right? So if you don't have express route though, then what the configuration would need to be would be sort of like a site-to-site VPN, where you would connect a particular network in your environment, in your own premises that has the databases, and that one will be connected through the VPN inside the virtual network where the ADMS is. Now, if you just do a vanilla VPN, then the traffic does go through the internet, but obviously VPNs are encrypted, so you're still protected in that way. There is basically no config where the traffic would just go in clear text, as long as you're using one of these two options, right? As I mentioned before, technically you could expose the ADMS to the internet, but that would be a really bad thing to do. And that there's no configuration by default that allows you to do this. You would have to intentionally go and expose it. So I would expect that most people are just not even going to make that mistake, because it's not easy to make that mistake either. And then there's another thing that right now is on private preview. I believe it's not on public preview yet, but I know it's on private preview. So private preview basically means that Microsoft has a few companies working with the particular feature to try to pilot the feature and grow it and make sure that it has the features that people want. And this is what's called a hybrid database migration service. And the idea of the ADMS in a hybrid configuration is that you have this kind of like this proxy machine on premises, which is called a migration worker. And so all the databases on premises will be sending information to the migration worker, and then the migration worker will be the only one that's actually communicating to the ADMS. Now, I think they're doing this, this hybrid configuration is mostly done for security reasons, so that you don't have to open an entire network segment to the ADMS, but instead you would just have to open one single machine to the ADMS, right? So you could have, all your network open to the migration worker, and then only the migration worker would be open out into Azure. So I think that's why this feature they created it. For probably some specific clients came up with some compliance or security issues with the previous configuration of with the express router or the VPN, and they asked for an option to just simply have basically one endpoint that will be communicating back to the ADMS. And this is the solution that Microsoft came up with so far. So we'll see. I don't know when this is actually going to go into public preview, but it's something there that if you start looking into the service and all of a sudden you see mentions of hybrid, then you know this is what it's talking about. Okay, and further down the line, once you see it available, then you saw it here first. All right. So service model we saw there in the portal, there's two different ones, right? There's standard and then there's premium, and they have different prices and capabilities. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is that you can create two database migration services per subscription, right? So just two per subscription. But I've asked around this, and it's not really because it's a technical limitation. It's mostly just like a procedure process limitation right now, where Microsoft wants to keep tabs or like not roll out the service super aggressively and let somebody create 100 DMSs on their subscription for no reason. So if you do need for some reason to create more ADMSs in your subscription and you have a good reason for it, then you can call support and they will lift the limit for you depending on how many you need, right? So it is doable. You just have to create a support ticket. It's not a hard-coded limitation where it's just like, oh no, it's something that you can't do and that's it, okay? All right, so tier number 1 is standard and has the option of running the migration service in 1, 2, or 4 cores. it does what the service calls offline migrations only. And when it says offline, basically what it means is that there is no constant sync of data. It basically takes a snapshot of the data and moves it over, and that's it. Okay, so that's what it means when it says it's offline migrations only. Most important part is that standard version of ADMS is free. That's it. There's no catch, no billing item. It's just free. There's nothing going to be charged for using the standard for doing your migration. But again, the catch is that it's for offline migrations only, right? It has to be databases that are small enough that you can just migrate them in one shot and that's it, right? You're not going to be migrating them over several periods. Um, Something that you might be thinking about that I thought was kind of strange too is that if there's options for 1, 2, or 4 cores and the service is free, then why would I ever select less than 4 cores, right? It's like somebody's telling you like, well, like we have free burgers today and we can give you the, the Big Mac or the, the one that comes after the Big Mac or just the plain burger, but they're all free. So which one are you going to pick? Of course, you're going to pick the Big Mac. I don't know why, like they expect people to pick 1 or 2 instead of 4 cores if it's free, right? Like I want my migration to go as fast as possible. So I'm always going to pick 4 cores. But you do have the choice. Every time that I've tested it, I just pick 4 because it's free. Why wouldn't I pick the most amount of cores that I can? And then premium, there's no choice. Premium is always 4 cores right now. And premium has the option of offline or online. But if you're going to do offline, then you can just use a standard one anyway. If you're doing online, so that means that you want to have some sort of data replication happening into Azure over a longer period of time, then you got to go with premium. Now, premium is about 40 cents, so 39.5 cents, that's US dollars an hour. So in 3 hours, you would be over $1. If we do the math here real quick, well, in 10 hours, you would be at 3.95. That means it's almost 4. That means in 20 hours, you'd be at almost $8. In 24 hours, you would be at almost $10, right? So in 1 day of running it, you would be at $10. That means they're running it for the whole month. 30 days, we're talking about 300 US dollars, right? So you might be thinking, oh man, that's kind of expensive, but there's 2 things to keep in mind. First is that the idea is that you will only use it once the migration is ready to go, right? So you're not going to be replicating to do a migration, even if it's a large database, you're not going to be replicating it for an entire month. You should just be, let's say that the cutover has to happen on Friday, then you should be setting it up maybe on, Monday, just to make sure that we have enough days. And then if you do the math, well, then it's only, 5 days, it's only $50 an hour. Sorry, $50 for the entire week that we used it. But most people are not even going to end up paying because Microsoft gives it to you for free for the first 6 months from the time that you make the service. So from creation, you have 6 months to actually use it, and it'll be free for those entire 6 months. Obviously, the incentive here is that once you start your migration project, you are going to just get it done in less than 6 months, right? So as long as you don't just put it off or forget about it, or the business doesn't change their mind, then if you get it all done in 6 months, it will just be free. You don't have to worry about it. So I expect that the vast majority of people are just going to take this offer and get it done in less than 6 months. And if they don't, then they're only going to be activating these services just for a few days, when they need that tight migration window. And then that's it. It's not really a service that you should leave running forever kind of thing, right? It's not really meant for that. And then the structure of the service, and this is going to be a lot more clear now that we are going to just roll into the demo, is as a service. And then after you create the service, you can create projects, and then the projects themselves have activities. Okay. And now let's look at the databases that are supported, because as I mentioned, it's not just SQL Server, right? So there is SQL Server, RDS SQL coming from AWS or Oracle can be migrated to Azure SQL DB. Same thing to Azure Managed Instance. Very interesting, for example, is that you can actually do Mongo into Cosmos DB. Something very interesting as well, of course, is they're working on enabling MySQL on-prem and RDS MySQL and PostgreSQL on-prem and RDS PostgreSQL to come into Azure DB for MySQL and Azure DB for PostgreSQL too, right? And for actual full-blown replication is we see something very similar as well. Same thing, keep in mind that these are all not just SQL Server, right? We see some Oracle, we see paths for Mongo to be moved into Cosmos and so on, right? So the service is not just for SQL Server. All right, and then let's just check out the actual migration that we're going to do, and that's going to be the bigger demo here. Now we're just going to focus on this for the rest of the session really today. So the first thing is I want to show you is that if you're not familiar with the data migration assistant, this is the tool that I mentioned that I recommend that everybody starts here before you actually do any migration. You start with the data migration assistant so that you can check on compatibility before you go and start actually migrating things, right? I'll walk you through just doing an assessment real quick. So it's very simple tool. If you're not familiar with it, this is the latest version. I just downloaded it like 2 days ago. So you just have to create new projects. So for example, here, there's two different types of projects. There's assessment and migration. So as I mentioned, if you have small databases, you can actually use the data migration assistant to do the migration itself, right? But if we want to work with bigger ones, with lots of databases at scale, then I would recommend assessments with data migration assistant and then the migration itself with the migration service. So anyway, let's go here and say it's a test project. And I want to do SQL Server to Azure SQL Database. Note that I do have more options though, right? Could do Azure SQL Database, Managed Instance, SQL Server and Azure VMs, or just SQL Server from SQL Server to SQL Server. And this lets you check on compatibility issues between different versions, right? So in our case, we are going to try SQL Server to Azure SQL DB. So I'm going to create it. And then it gives you a couple of options here as well. So one is to check the database compatibility, right? To make sure that if there's any deprecated issues, that might be a problem. And the other one is check feature parity to make sure that all the features that you have been using in one of them are included in the other. And then they have this thing I just saw last time. Now that I installed it, it says it's coming soon. It is that it's going to give you or recommend you new features that are in the version of SQL that you want to go into that you don't have right now. So for example, if you are on SQL 2005 or 2008, like column stores didn't exist back then, right? And if you have a really, really large table, then it makes a lot of sense to recommend that, hey, if you go into Azure SQL DB or you go into SQL Server 2017, you should definitely look at column stores, for example, right? So it looks like that is coming soon, so that's pretty cool. For now, I'm just going to leave these two. Just click next. Like I said, these tools are all very easy to use. A server name, I'm going to use this local machine where I have my SQL 2008 instance. Try to connect to that. And we can see here I have my AdventureWorks database. So I'm just going to select my AdventureWorks. Now, this is something that I'm not going to do here in the demo, but if you you can actually capture extended events or profiler traces with SQL statements. And the tool will look into those statements and look for compatibility issues as well. So that's another thing that you can do. I'm not going to do that for the demo, but right now here, I am going to just select the database. And that's it. You can just click on Start Assessment. It's very, very simple, like I said. And you just wait a little bit, and we'll have the results of our assessment. And remember, I selected the target to be Azure SQL Database, right? So anything that is going to tell us about is basically by comparing the SQL 2008 to the Azure SQL Database differences. So there are several things here that we are an issue, right? So you can see, for example, there are some cross-database references apparently in AdventureWorks, and this is not supported in Azure SQL Database, right? So that's a problem. You can still migrate it, right? You can still move the code and you can migrate the data, but once you try to execute that code that's doing the cross-database reference, it's not going to work, right? And the second one, for example, is telling you file stream is not supported in Azure SQL Database, right? We know that. So there's no file stream file groups in Azure SQL Database. I believe there's none in managed instance yet. Maybe they will enable it in managed instance at some point. So if you have something that's being created on FileStream, then it's not going to be able to be created in Azure SQL Database, right? And then, for example, Service Broker is something else that, in this case, AdventureWorks has it enabled. You can see here where it says AdventureWorks, this database has Service Broker enabled. Well, it's not going to work at all in Azure SQL DB, right? And you can see here, there's it does give you some warnings about full text search because not all the features of full text search are supported yet on Azure SQL DB, right? So very important, obviously, if you're actually planning to migrate, the migration service is great in general, but is not a whole solution, right? You need to do this analysis yourself first and make sure that you are migrating the right things and making a good job, right? And not just migrate something that's going to be broken, right? So it's good to keep in mind all these things. Like I said, I recommend that you start with this analysis. Now, let's say we know now the compatibility issues that we have, but we want to go ahead and migrate it anyway. So we're going to create you can see the options here at the top, right? So I have this that says new migration project. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick a new migration project. And let's say we're going to call it, the project name is going to be the Sao Paulo migration. And I'm going to be doing SQL Server to Azure SQL Database. And I'm just going to do an offline data migration here for the demo. And now look here at the bottom, it says create and run activity. So remember the hierarchy here is we have the service. Inside the service, we create projects, and inside the projects, we can run activities, right? So we're going to go forward here and just say we want to run activity. Now, the first thing is that we need to give it a source. So the source is this VM that I am sitting on, right? So I'm just going to give it a name. Now, keep in mind, the reason why I can actually connect to my source SQL Server here is because my ADMS that I am working on right now and this SQL 2008 VM are in the same virtual network inside Azure, right? So that's how they can communicate through the network. And then I am going to be just providing my Windows authentication credentials. Okay, so that the ADMS can connect on my behalf to the source. Okay, and I'll just wait a little bit there. Okay, so that was the source, right? My SQL 2008 VM. Now we got to give it the target. So this has to be an existing Azure SQL Database server. So in my case, I already have one. It's called Perf Demos, and I'm going to be using my admin account for this one as well. So I gotta punch in my credentials, and that should work. So we got our connection metadata set up now. Okay, so we're good there. Now we gotta select the databases that we are going to migrate, right? So I select the AdventureWorks. This is the one that's coming from my on-prem SQL. And now I'm going to select a target database. So this is something also that you have to keep in mind. You have to create an empty database before, okay? So this is something that I already did before we started the session today. I just created a blank database. As you can see here, it's called AdventureWorks Demo. All right. And there is an option here. I'm not going to use it right now, but you can see something really interesting here is to set the source database as read only, right? So the idea here is that if you're doing the migration and it's the real migration this time, right? We're not playing around with demos, it's not a test anymore. Then you set the source database as read only so that people can no longer be modifying the source database once you start the migration process, right? So I'm not going to use it right now, but that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So now we see here, there's an issue, right? It says the target table does not exist. So what's happening here? This is something that bit me the first time that I used the DMS, is that the service also expects, if you're going to migrate data, that you have the schema already created. Okay, so you can either pre-create the schema with the database migration assistant, or the database migration service can actually create the schema for you. So if we go back here into the migration service, and I go into my Sao Paulo migration, I'm going to create a new activity now. See where it says, there's a schema only migration as well, right? So I need to get that schema created before we can actually move the data over. I think, in my opinion, this is kind of like silly extra step that Microsoft is making people do right now, because if it doesn't find the schema and I'm already at the step where I wanted to do a data migration, then it should just go ahead and create the schema as part of the thing, right? But right now, this is how it works. So we're going to add a new activity, but this time it's going to be the schema only. Something that's kind of annoying right now as well, I don't know if they're going to fix or make this easier, is that every time you create a new activity, you do have to punch in your credentials again. So it saves the metadata, but it doesn't save the password that you used, or at least it doesn't do it on the portal. I assume maybe at some point they'll provide some sort of key vault integration or something like that. So yeah, you don't have to keep putting your credentials over and over. But right now, this is how it works. So, all right. So now what we're going to do, same thing. We pick the target database. But now it's making us select. Okay, so how are we going to generate the schema to apply to the target? And it is this way. So either we generate it from a source, or we do it through a schema file. In this case, I'm going to generate it from a source, because all I want to do is for the database migration service to go into this AdventureWorks 2008, generate the schema, and then apply it to my AdventureWorks demo database. Okay. And then there's some validation options. If you wanted to, you can see it could do the work and then do a schema comparison to make sure that you actually have all the different objects and give you a report in the end. I'm not going to do it now. You guys can try it out. If you have access to an Azure subscription, the standard database migration service is free anyway. But there is that option there to validate, right? In this case, I'm just going to have it not validate. And then we just run the migration, and that's it. Oh, I need to give it an activity name. Migration of schema. And just run. Okay. And as you can see here, it's got pending. We'll see if it starts to run. There it is, running, generating script. So this is going to start running. I'm just going to go back into my migration service, and I'm just going to show you guys one of the migrations that I've already completed, so we don't have to wait for that to be done. Or while that is completing, actually, we'll just look at what's going to happen. This is kind of like a cooking show where we see all the steps, and then at the end they just show you the cake. It's already baked. So this one I ran a few days ago, and you can see the schema migration completes. It will complete, but it will complete with warnings. Of course, it completes with warnings because we know that there are some issues here in terms of parity of features between AdventureWorks and Azure SQL DB, right? So, and I haven't fixed them as AdventureWorks, right? Obviously, if it was an actual application from your business, then you would need to work on these features to make it compatible and then do that migration. But in this case, I just went ahead with migration anyway. So you can see here, right, what's going to happen is we're going to get a bunch of different errors, right? And the reason why we get a bunch of different errors is if we look right down here, the problem is that this is an object that has file stream, right? So like we saw in the Database Migration Assistant, file stream is not supported in Azure SQL DB, so file stream doesn't work when we try to create this particular table. So it fails to create this particular table. And then because it doesn't have that particular table, then all the different things that are dependent on that table will fail. So all these different, for example, you can see here, it just says over and over, object is invalid, right? So it's trying to create extended properties on columns for an object that doesn't exist, right? So the file stream table doesn't exist. So all the creation of the extended properties are going to fail, right? If we keep scrolling down, it's the same thing, right? Eventually what we see is that same thing, object is invalid, cannot be found, but the foreign keys start to fail, right? Because we can't create foreign keys right here. We can't create foreign keys to a table that doesn't exist, right? So again, you would use the data migration assistant to figure out these issues. Something that I do want to point out though is that we have this completed with warnings, right? And one table failed to create, but the rest of the schema got deployed, right? So it's not an all or nothing kind of migration process, right? Now let's go back and see if our Sao Paulo migration is done. Okay, so this one is still running. We'll give it a little bit of time, maybe there like a minute for it to complete it. Oh, it's done now, completed with warnings. Good. And you can see the same thing, right? All right, so then we have the schema now, but like I said before, it's not all or nothing. So even though we got those warnings and the errors with the file stream object, all the other objects got created, right? So now we can still just go ahead. Let's just go ahead and do the data migration, right? So again, unfortunately, I still have to put in this again. All right. And save this again. And now when I select this, you can see here, AdventureWorks demo. You can see the difference now. Okay, so before we had all those that said target table does not exist, target table does not exist over and over. Now instead it's just auto mapping the tables based on the schema that it finds in both places, right? And you can see there's 70 tables. So this is something else that you can do as well. If you don't need to migrate your entire database, you just want to migrate a few tables, then in this screen, you can actually pick just a few, right? Or leave some of them behind. Now, of course, you have to keep in mind that if you don't migrate them all, then if you have some foreign keys or things like this, those might fail because they might be dependent on data that you didn't decide to migrate, right? So just something to keep in mind, but you do have the choice to select or deselect specific tables, okay? And then I'll just say, yes, done. And then I'll do my Sao Paulo copy, let's call it. And the validation. So there's a few options here for validation for that data movement. So there's 3 options. So first is the schema comparison, which is similar to when we just do the schema copy. Then the next one is this data consistency one. So what it happens here, if you select data consistency, I'll show you here what it says actually. And let me zoom into that. it says that it's going to validate it by doing a checksum of the data in the source and the target databases to make sure that they have the exact same data. Now this, if it's a small database with just a few megs or very small amounts of gigs, by all means, you can checksum it all and compare it, and you can sleep well at night knowing that exactly the same data is there. However, imagine if we're talking about hundreds of gigs or even terabytes of data being checksummed by this service. It is very, very resource intensive, right? So I would not recommend that you do a validation through checksums if the data is like more than a few gigabytes, because otherwise that's just way too intensive in terms of resources that it is going to consume, right? You're going to be basically going into every single row, computing the checksum, and then comparing between source and target, which is, lots of CPU cycles burned there. The other option that we have is this query correctness as well. So what it does here is it can run a select query on the source database and then rerun it on the target database. And then that gives you the option of just seeing if a particular query has the same results, right? So that's what this option is, the query correctness option, right? In this case, I'm just not gonna validate them, but would recommend that if you're doing a real production, maybe you would want to use query correctness. I don't recommend that you would use data consistency unless it's a very, very small database, right? And once you got that going and it's configured, then you just press run migration. And then we'll just wait to see there. Let's booting up the project. I'll show you in my the one that's already completed, because this does take a while. Even though AdventureWorks is not that big, I think it takes about 10 minutes to migrate it over. So anyway, here, I'll just show you right away what it looks like when it's complete. So here's the move data. You can see here I ran this a few days ago. 70 of 70 tables complete, and it does take, yeah, like almost 11 minutes to run. Now, if you do go into it, something that's kind of cool is that you can actually go into the migration process and sort it by duration. And you can see, like, for example, the person table in AdventureWorks takes 3 minutes to migrate, right? Compared to all the other tables that just take, next one just takes a little bit over a minute. And then after that, they all take less than a minute to complete. And then many of them just take a few seconds. So for example, if you are, let's say you need to measure really well, really accurate how long the migration is going to take, then, well, you could just run a test migration, and then you have all these times already here handy for you. You'll know exactly how long it's going to take, right? So that's, I thought, was pretty useful. And you can even sort it so you know even exactly which tables are going to take longer than other tables and so on. So that's pretty useful for a real production migration. Let's just see here if this might, yeah, so this is already ongoing now. And you can see 25 of 70 tables have completed. And if you click on it, it actually tells you all the tables that are completed and all the ones that are pending too. So again, if somebody says like, oh my God, how much longer does the migration have to go? Well, if you know how long the other ones took, and you know where it's going right now, then at least you can get a good idea of how much longer it's going to be running for, right? So if I refresh this, we know that the person one is the longest one. So far it's run for 43 seconds. So we know it takes about 3 minutes to run. So it's got at least another 2 minutes to go, and then all the other ones. So at least it gives you an idea of how far it is into the migration process, right? And once you are you're done, then that's pretty much it. So if you look at the end here, well, I just have my 70 of 70 tables completed. Of course, we know that the file stream table was not migrated because it wasn't able to get created, but all the other ones that were mapped were migrated. And then at that point, you would just fail over your application and then figure out, make sure that everything's working well. help developers connect and whatnot, right? All that, of course, is still part of your responsibility after the migration is over. And then once the migration is over, if you really wanted to, you could just go ahead and delete the service and you will be done with it, right? If you do want to keep the service, but you don't want to be spending money if you're actually paying for it, like in the premium where you pay by the hour and you're over your 6 months of free, then you can actually stop the service if you wanted to. If you are completely done and your migration has been a total success and you don't want to leave just objects lying around, then you can delete the service and that's it. You are done. All right. So yeah, that's it's 8:55 here in Canada. So we're at the top of the hour. We have 5 more minutes. So if there's any questions, I guess we have a few minutes here, and now's the perfect time.
Hey, Warner. First of all, thank you. Thank you again. It was an amazing session. We have a question here. Anderson is asking uh, if there is something that we can improve about our performance if we first create a virtual machine on Azure and then we migrate all your database to this virtual machine, and then after that we migrate to SQL database. If there is something that we, if this is something that we could do, and if this is something recommended.
Um, it could. I mean, it kind of depends, right? I mean, if you have a really, let's say, like some sort of unreliable connection,
Mhm.
and then you just, it takes you do something like, for example, like log shipping into Azure, because log shipping, right? We know it like just is copying logs and it applies it every now and then kind of thing. It's not a constant connection, right? So if it goes down, it's okay for a little while. Um, so in that scenario, maybe it would make sense to do something because you can't do like a log shipping for ADMS, right? What it does, what it uses under the covers for ongoing replication is actually, I believe it is SQL replication under the covers, what it uses. Um, or CDC, I think it might be enabled as well. But anyway, the point would be is that there are technologies that require constant connection. So if maybe that's a good if your connection is not that good, then I could see how maybe log shipping into a SQL VM into Azure as a first step makes sense. And then once it's in Azure, then you don't have to worry about those connectivity problems, right? And then the nice thing about it, of course, is that if you're in the cloud, once you do the last step and you're done with the SQL VM, then you just delete it and that's it, right? So yeah, there could be certain scenarios like that one that I just mentioned where it could make sense to have an intermediate SQL VM.
Oh, awesome, awesome, Warnie. I believe we don't have any questions right now, but we have a lot of thanks and a lot of people saying that it was an amazing session, and I can say the same. So, thank
Oh,
you
well,
again,
that's
Warner.
great. Thank you guys, and as well, I just encourage you. Um, if you have any access to Azure, or if you're willing to just put a little bit of your own money into it, there's definitely a lot that you can learn about this process. Because if you think about it, Azure SQL DB, I just migrated into a basic database that is $5 a month, and they're charged by the hour, right? So it's pretty much cents in the time that it takes you to play around with it. Like, let's say you want to play around with a migration, and even if you pay for it, the whole test, like the migration service is free, right? The cost of a basic database for, let's say you're playing around with it for 3 or 4 hours, is literally less than a $1, right? And all you need is a source SQL. And even if you just don't even have a source SQL on premises or like in your machine or in your laptop or whatever, um, you can make a SQL VM in Azure and run pay SQL by the hour, or not even pay SQL by the hour. You could make a Windows VM in Azure and install SQL Developer, which you and I know is 100% free nowadays, which is great, by the way. That's a great decision from Microsoft. So you could do the entire end-to-end test of the migration, play around with the service and everything for, you know, less than a few dollars, right? $4 or $5 tops, possibly, right? So definitely is something that is not a big barrier of entry for most people to play around with and learn on your own. So I do want to encourage that. You know, if you think this might be useful, if it might come down in your job at some point and you want to learn it, it doesn't cost a lot to learn, right? It's not like Azure SQL Data Warehouse where people get scared of just like how much it is to just boot a basic data warehouse and play around with it for a little while, right? It's not like that. So hopefully, yeah, hopefully it was useful, and hopefully I will have another session for you guys in the coming months as well, and we'll come back with something else.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Thank you again, Warner. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate that. Valeu, galera. Obrigado a todos vocês que acompanharam aí. Foi muito bacana. Uma apresentação dessa, a gente não pode perder essa oportunidade. A gente se encontra na próxima, pessoal. Bom descanso aí para todos e até a próxima.
Boa noite para todos.
Boa noite, Warner. Obrigado.
All right. Talk to you guys. Good night.